Have you ever realized you were paying the mortgage on the roof over your head with your own stolen life? They called me a worthless charity case, forcing me to be the invisible workhorse of their luxury empire for 10 long years. They demanded a lifetime of silent gratitude. But what happens when the perfect family realizes their exploited servant is actually the landlord of their entire existence? The bill is due, and I am collecting it all. Hello. Welcome back to Maya Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with zero budget to keep operating. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking team to survive and keep creating for you. You can donate by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. My name is Vanessa Cross, and this is my story. The air in Aspen, Colorado, was a razor blade against my skin. It was late December, and the wind whipping down the mountain carried a biting, suffocating cold that sank straight into my bones. I was 28 years old, standing in the shadows of a multi-million-dollar glass and timber pavilion, shivering in a thin, cheap polyester blazer. Inside, bathed in the warm, golden glow of crystal chandeliers, the elite of American society raised glasses of vintage champagne to celebrate the winter wedding of the year. My adoptive brother, Julian Vance, was marrying Savannah Thorne. Savannah was an intelligent, sharp-witted corporate lawyer from a proud, old money family, while Julian was the golden boy of Valerius Holdings, an ultra-luxury real estate development firm, or rather, that was the facade they sold to the world. The truth was far colder than the Aspen snow. I was the invisible architectural genius, keeping the entire Valerius empire from collapsing under the weight of Julian's staggering incompetence. Every soaring vault, every structurally impossible cantilevered balcony, every sustainable foundation that had graced the covers of architectural digests over the past 5 years had come off my drafting table. Yet, Julian stood in the spotlight, shaking hands with investors, absorbing the praise, claiming my brilliance as his own. I was not a guest at this wedding. I was the unpaid house manager, the event coordinator, the invisible workhorse. Eleanor Vance, my adoptive mother, had made her instructions explicitly clear that morning. "Do not mingle, Vanessa," Eleanor had snapped, her manicured fingers adjusting a diamond necklace that cost more than a house. "You are here to ensure everything runs perfectly. Stay out of sight. We cannot have Julian's new in-laws asking uncomfortable questions about our charity case on his big day." Charity case? That was the label they slapped on me 11 years ago. I was 17 when my biological parents died in a sudden, horrific accident. The Vances, longtime acquaintances, swooped in with open arms, but the warmth vanished the moment the front door closed. Arthur Vance sat me down in his plush, oak-paneled study and laid out a stack of forged financial documents. He looked me directly in the eyes and told me my parents had died penniless, leaving behind millions in hidden toxic debt. The Vances claimed they were graciously paying it off to keep my family name out of the tabloids and to keep me out of a group home. In exchange, I owed them my life. Literally, my adulthood became a grueling marathon of unpaid labor, designed to repay a salvation I never asked for and a debt that never actually existed. I rubbed my freezing hands together, watching the glamorous crowd through the floor-to-ceiling glass panes I had personally engineered to withstand extreme blizzard wind loads. The contrast was nauseating. Extreme wealth paraded inside, wrapped in cashmere and silk, while the invisible labor that built their cathedral stood outside, freezing to death in a clearance rack jacket. Suddenly, the sleek, synchronized machinery of the reception hit a snag. Near the grand entrance, an 8-foot-tall, intricately carved ice sculpture of a soaring falcon served as the centerpiece of the raw bar. A heavy-set groomsman, at least 4 Scotch drinks deep, staggered backward, laughing loudly at a joke. His broad shoulders slammed directly into the pedestal. The massive block of ice tilted. Time seemed to slow down. The catering staff froze in sheer panic. If that sculpture fell, it would shatter a glass table, ruin the hors d'oeuvres, and likely fracture the leg of anyone caught underneath. I did not think. I moved. I bolted from the shadows, sliding across the polished marble floor. My mind automatically calculated the vector of the fall, the mass of the ice, and the exact fulcrum point required to reverse the momentum. It was pure physics. Torque equals force times radius, I muttered under my breath, my voice barely a whisper in the chaotic noise of the room. I threw my body weight low, wedging my shoulder against the tipping pedestal, while simultaneously hooking my right foot around the base to anchor it. I applied a highly specific, complex leverage technique, locking my joints to turn my own frame into a temporary structural brace. The heavy ice groaned, hovering precariously over the point of no return for one agonizing second. Then, slowly, painfully, I guided the center of gravity back to its axis. The sculpture settled onto the base with a heavy thud. The drunken groomsman blinked, entirely oblivious to the disaster he had just caused, and stumbled away toward the bar. I exhaled a sharp breath, my muscles screaming in protest from the sudden, massive exertion. I quickly wiped a bead of freezing sweat from my forehead, preparing to slip back out into the cold mountain night before Eleanor spotted me. But I was not unobserved. Across the room, standing completely still near the edge of the dance floor, was Marcus Thorne, Savannah's father. He was a retired insurance fraud investigator, a man who had spent 40 years reading the microscopic details people tried desperately to hide. Marcus was not looking at me with the gentle, condescending pity the other guests reserved for the Vance family's troubled charity case. His piercing blue eyes were locked onto my posture, tracking the exact mechanics of how I had just stopped a 500-pound disaster. He saw the structural calculation. He saw the deliberate, educated placement of my stance. He was looking at me with an intense, calculating suspicion in that single, quiet moment amidst the glittering chaos of the Aspen wedding. Marcus Thorne realized the narrative he had been fed about the slow, broken girl in the cheap blazer was a spectacular lie. He saw the spark of genius, and for the first time in a decade, I knew someone was finally looking at the real me. I retreated toward the terrace doors. The freezing air hit me again. I wrapped my arms around my chest to stop the violent shaking. Footsteps sounded behind me, heavy, deliberate, not the erratic stumbling of a drunken guest. I turned. Marcus Thorne stood there. He shrugged off his heavy wool overcoat. He stepped forward and draped the expensive fabric over my shivering shoulders. The warmth was immediate. I looked up. He did not smile. His piercing blue eyes were scanning the massive vaulted ceiling above us. He was a retired investigator. His entire career was built on finding the hidden fractures in a perfectly constructed lie. The lateral load on a span this wide should require central support pillars, Marcus said. His voice was flat, analytical. It was the tone of an interrogation, disguised as casual conversation. Yet the floor is entirely open. How did the architect distribute the weight without compromising the sheer walls? It was a trap, a brilliant, highly technical trap. I was freezing, exhausted, and running on pure adrenaline. I walked right into it. For 10 years, I had carefully hidden my intellect. I played the role they assigned me, but architecture was my reflex. It was my mother tongue. The architect used a hidden diagrid structural frame, I replied. My voice lost its timid edge. It gained a sudden, steady, authoritative cadence. The load is not transferred vertically. It is redirected outward into the reinforced perimeter beams. I raised my hands. I began to trace the invisible geometry in the cold air. The tension cable system within the roof structure acts like a suspension bridge. It pulls the opposing forces into equilibrium. As I drew the peak of the vault, my left hand betrayed me. It started the tell, a highly distinct, rhythmic lateral vibration across my knuckles. It was a harmless kinetic tremor, a rare genetic quirk that activated only during moments of intense, focused physical precision. I dropped my hand immediately. I shoved it deep into the pocket of the borrowed coat, but Marcus had seen it. His breath hitched, the color drained from his weathered face. The retired fraud investigator was no longer looking at a wedding coordinator. He was looking at a ghost. His mind was racing. I could see the puzzle pieces snapping together behind his eyes. Procedural, methodical, relentless. 20 years ago. Marcus investigated a massive insurance claim. It involved the suspicious deaths of the Cross family. They were billionaire architectural tycoons. A tragic plane crash. A closed case that never sat right with him. The patriarch of that family possessed the exact same structural genius, and he had the exact same unmistakable kinetic tremor in his left hand. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. His voice dropped to a fierce whisper. "Who are your people?" Before I could answer, a sharp clatter of heels broke the tension. Eleanor Vance materialized from the crowd. Her smile was tight. Her eyes darted from Marcus to me. She noted the heavy wool coat on my shoulders. She registered the intense, interrogating stare of the retired investigator. Eleanor's polished society mask slipped. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. Pure, unadulterated panic. "Marcus," Eleanor chirped. Her pitch was entirely too high. "I see you found our little helper, Vanessa. You are needed in the kitchen. Now." She grabbed my arm. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin like talons. She yanked me away from him. As she dragged me through the narrow service corridor, she bumped hard into my side. Her hand brushed the pocket of my blazer. I thought nothing of it. My heart was pounding too fast from the encounter with Marcus. 10 minutes later, the music stopped. The sudden silence in the grand hall was deafening. I stepped out from the kitchen's swinging doors. Arthur Vance stood by the main microphone on the stage. His face was a mask of furious disappointment. Julian stood beside him, feigning outrage. Savannah looked entirely confused. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse this terrible interruption," Arthur announced. His voice echoed across the marble floor. "It pains me deeply to say this, but my future daughter-in-law's wedding band has gone missing from the bridal suite." Gasps rippled through the elite crowd. Savannah touched her bare ring finger, genuinely shocked. "We believe we know who took it," Arthur continued. His eyes locked onto me. The entire room turned. Hundreds of wealthy guests stared at me. "Vanessa, come here." My feet felt like lead. I walked toward the center of the room. Eleanor stood nearby. She had her arms crossed, playing the heartbroken mother perfectly. "Empty your pockets," Arthur commanded. "I have been working the floor all night," I said. My voice remained remarkably calm. "I have not been near the bridal suite." "Empty them," he barked. I reached into the right pocket of my blazer. Nothing. I reached into the left. My fingers brushed against a heavy, cold circle of metal. My stomach plummeted. I pulled it out. The platinum band caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. A flawless diamond flashed aggressively. The ring was worth $200,000. The crowd erupted into furious whispers. Eleanor let out a dramatic, sobbing gasp. "After everything we have done for you," Arthur spat. He projected his voice for the entire room to hear. "We took you in, we saved you from ruin, and you repay us by stealing from Julian's bride." "This was planted," I said clearly. I did not yell. I looked directly at Eleanor. "You bumped into me in the hallway." "Liar," Julian snarled, stepping forward. "You have always been jealous. Always." "We are not calling the police," Arthur declared. He raised a hand to silence the room. "I will not have Julian's wedding day ruined by a police investigation, but we are done. We are finally washing our hands of you. You are a hopeless thief. Vanessa." He pointed toward the massive glass doors. "Get out. Take your car keys and leave. Never set foot near this family again." I looked at Marcus Thorne. He stood perfectly still in the crowd. He did not look angry. He looked analytical. He was watching the Vance family perform their theatrical outrage. He knew. I dropped the ring onto the nearest silver tray. It spun briefly before clattering to a halt. I turned my back on the glittering hall. I pushed open the heavy glass doors. The freezing aspen night swallowed me whole. I had nothing but my car keys. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, and I had a mind that was already calculating their demolition. The heater in my rusted sedan rattled like a dying breath, spitting out lukewarm air that did nothing to fight the sub-zero mountain night. I sat in the driver's seat in an empty, snow-covered parking lot 2 miles down the mountain from the wedding venue. The engine idled rough. The dashboard clock read 11:45. I did not shed a single tear over the dramatic banishment. Tears were a biological waste of hydration and energy. My mind was already compartmentalizing the variables of my survival. I had a quarter tank of gas, $42 in cash, and a laptop hidden under the passenger seat. I was calculating the exact cost of a motel room versus sleeping in the car when a sharp, authoritative rap on the driver's side window shattered the quiet. I flinched, my hand instinctively reaching for the heavy steel flashlight I kept in the door panel. I peered through the frosted glass. Marcus Thorne stood in the ankle-deep snow. He was alone. His expensive wool coat shielded him from the biting wind, but his face was grim and unreadable. I unlocked the door. "Get in the passenger seat," I said, my voice completely devoid of the trembling victim persona I had worn for a decade. "You are letting the cold in." Marcus walked around the front of the sedan and slid into the passenger side. Pulling the heavy door shut, the confined space of the beat-up car felt instantly smaller. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer empty platitudes about the cruel spectacle Arthur had just orchestrated. He simply reached inside his coat and pulled out a thick manila folder bound with 2 heavy rubber bands. He dropped it onto the center console. "I have spent the last 4 hours making secure phone calls to my former colleagues in the Federal Bureau," Marcus said, his breath pluming in the frigid cabin air. "I pulled the archived files from the Cross Aviation accident 20 years ago, the insurance claim I investigated before I retired. I knew your father's structural engineering signatures by heart. The tremor in his left hand translated into a very specific, microscopic variance in his hand-drawn stress loads. You have the exact same variance." I stared at the folder. I reached out and pulled it onto my lap, snapping the rubber bands. "Read the financial summary," Marcus instructed, his tone purely procedural. I flipped past the gruesome crime scene photos of the twisted aircraft fuselage. I found the redacted financial ledgers. My eyes scanned the typed columns. According to the official narrative, Arthur and Eleanor Vance had beaten into my head since I was 17. My parents died drowning in toxic, high-yield corporate debt. The Vances claimed they liquidated everything just to keep the creditors from taking my freedom. The documents in my lap told a vastly different story. My parents did not die in debt. They died leaving behind a multi-billion-dollar blind trust. The exact valuation at the time of their death was $2.4 billion in liquid assets and prime real estate holdings. "Arthur Vance was your father's lead forensic accountant," Marcus said, his voice lowering into a deadly register. "When the plane went down, Arthur fabricated a mountain of fraudulent liabilities. He forged a series of guardianship papers. He locked your family wealth into an offshore holding company and legally appointed himself the sole executor of the estate. He gaslighted you into believing you were a destitute burden so he could use your inheritance to build Valerius Holdings. He stole your empire." Vanessa. Marcus watched me closely, bracing himself for the emotional breakdown. He expected shock. He expected a shattered reality. He expected me to cry. I closed the folder. I slowly rested my hands on the steering wheel. I felt the cold, hard crystallization of absolute rage settle into my chest. The victimhood was gone. It burned away, leaving behind a predatory focus so sharp it felt like a physical weapon. "I know," I said. Marcus blinked. The legendary investigator was genuinely caught off guard. "You know? I have known I was not broke for 3 years," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I reached under my seat and pulled out my heavy, reinforced laptop. I set it on the dashboard. "Arthur is a brilliant liar, but he is a sloppy architect. 3 years ago, he forced me to fix the structural load calculations for a luxury high-rise in Miami. I needed to access the foundational budget to authorize reinforced steel. I bypassed his secure network out of pure necessity. I found a shadow ledger. I opened the laptop. The screen illuminated the dark, freezing car with a pale blue glow. I did not know the exact dollar amount," I continued, typing in a heavily encrypted 32-character password. "And I did not know the money originally belonged to my parents. I just thought Arthur was embezzling from his own investors, But I knew the charity case narrative was a lie. I knew he was hiding capital. So I stopped being the dutiful daughter, and I became a parasite. I turned the screen toward Marcus. Rows upon rows of meticulously organized digital files filled the display. For 36 months, I have been quietly using my administrative access to Valerius Holdings to clone their entire digital infrastructure. I have every forged email, every illegal wire transfer, every offshore account routing number, and every single architectural blueprint they have ever filed. I have been building a guillotine. I just did not have the power to drop the blade without going to prison for corporate espionage. I looked away from the screen and met Marcus's eyes. I knew they were thieves. Marcus, but looking at your insurance files, looking at the maintenance logs for my parents' aircraft, I realize I was wrong about them. They are not just thieves, Marcus said quietly. They are murderers, I finished. The silence in the car was absolute, broken only by the rattling heater. We were no longer an old man and a disgraced housemaid. We were a silent, lethal partnership forming in the dark. Marcus had the federal connections, the legal authority, and the courtroom credibility. I had the digital and structural blueprints of the Vance's entire fraudulent existence. Julian is launching his flagship mega project tomorrow night in Manhattan, Marcus noted, leaning back against the worn fabric of the seat. The Valerius Tower, it is a 60-story skyscraper. They are desperate for a massive influx of international capital to cover the offshore deficits you just showed me. If that building opens, they secure another $1 billion in backing. They become untouchable. That building is not opening, I stated. I turned the laptop back to face me. I opened a hidden root directory. I officially dropped the obedient, invisible workhorse persona forever. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a series of commands I had prepared months ago as a theoretical failsafe. Julian took the credit for designing the Valerius Tower, I explained, initiating a silent protocol. But I drew the foundational blueprints. I engineered the load-bearing columns. Architecture is entirely about balance. Marcus, if you shift a single integer in a zoning application, if you reclassify a structural support designation from commercial industrial to light residential in the municipal database, the entire project becomes a catastrophic liability. A progress bar appeared on my screen, rapidly filling with green blocks as my override commands penetrated the city's automated building and safety department servers. "What are you doing?" Marcus asked, watching the code cascade down the screen. "I am legally condemning Julian's masterpiece," I replied. "I embedded a fatal zoning flaw in the foundational blueprints 2 years ago. I am activating it now. By midnight tonight, the Valerius Tower will be officially classified as a public safety hazard. It cannot legally open, and when the investors demand their money back, the Vances will have nothing but empty offshore accounts." I hit the final execution key. The system confirmed the upload. The trap was set. The board was rigged. The perfect American family was about to wake up and realize the servant they had abused for a decade was the landlord of their destruction. 72 hours later, the illusion of the Vance empire began to crack. Inside the penthouse boardroom of Valerius Holdings, Arthur and Julian stared at a glowing monitor in absolute terror. Their secure offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate. Millions of dollars were dissolving into thin air, rerouted through a labyrinth of encrypted digital firewalls. Julian smashed a crystal tumbler against the wall. They immediately knew who was holding the knife. They assumed it was a petty retaliation for the Aspen incident. They thought a desperate, broke girl with a stolen administrative password was trying to steal a petty severance package. They had no idea they were already dead. Arthur did not hesitate. He utilized the immense resources he had stolen from my family to orchestrate a brutal, illegal strike. He paid off a corrupt local magistrate to sign a sealed midnight warrant for corporate espionage and cyber terrorism. Then, he hired a team of private tactical mercenaries to execute the arrest. The objective was entirely corrupt. Find me, plant a hard drive of classified corporate data in my possession, drag me into a federal holding cell without bail, and silence me permanently before I could bleed their accounts dry. They tracked my sedan to a cheap, roadside motel on the freezing outskirts of Denver. At exactly 2 in the morning, 4 heavily armed mercenaries kicked in the door of room number 11. They swept the dark, cramped space with tactical flashlights, their weapons drawn and ready for a struggle. But there was no target. The cheap motel bed was perfectly made. The closet was entirely empty. There was no laptop. There was no frightened girl hiding in the bathroom. There was only a cheap, plastic burner phone resting exactly in the center of a worn wooden desk. Arthur and Julian stood in the freezing parking lot outside, waiting for the extraction. The lead mercenary walked out of the room, holding the phone in his gloved hand. He handed it to Arthur just as the screen illuminated brightly in the dark. An incoming call. Arthur snatched the device and pressed it aggressively to his ear. "We will find you, Vanessa," Arthur hissed. His voice was trembling with a dangerous mix of fury and genuine panic. "You think you can steal from me? You are going to rot in a federal black site for the rest of your miserable life." I was sitting in a secure, leather-bound chair inside a federal prosecutor's office 3 states away, watching the motel raid unfold through a hacked municipal traffic camera. My voice over the line was entirely devoid of emotion. It was the dead calm of a surgeon holding a scalpel, making the first incision. "You are not hunting me, Arthur," I replied softly. "You just walked into a cage." "You committed corporate espionage," he snarled, looking around the dark parking lot as if I were hiding in the shadows. "We have the warrant. The judge is in my pocket. You are finished." "It is not espionage when you are accessing your own accounts," I corrected him, letting the truth drop like an anvil. "It is called a legal repatriation of stolen assets. At 9 o'clock this morning, Marcus Thorne and I submitted my verified DNA profile to the Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the original, unredacted trust documents you buried 20 years ago. The federal government has already frozen every single domestic and international asset connected to Valerius Holdings. The money draining from your offshore accounts is not a theft. It is an active federal seizure." I could hear Arthur's breathing stop. The absolute, suffocating silence on his end of the line was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my 28 years of existence. The Grandmaster just realized his king was trapped. "Paw!" "Put Julian on," I commanded. There was a frantic shuffle. Julian's arrogant, panicked voice came through the speaker. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little freak," Julian started. "The Valerius Tower," I interrupted, cutting through his desperate bravado like a scythe. "Your flagship masterpiece. The one you are supposed to unveil to the world tomorrow night." "What did you do?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking violently. "I filed the original foundational blueprints," I casually informed him. "The ones you happily signed your name on to steal the credit. I just pointed out to the city inspector that the primary load-bearing columns on the sublevel have a fatal zoning flaw I deliberately embedded 2 years ago. The concrete stress tests you submitted were fraudulent. The entire structural integrity is severely compromised." I let the crushing weight of the realization suffocate him for a few seconds before delivering the final, devastating blow. "The Department of Building Safety officially condemned your 60-story skyscraper at exactly midnight. You cannot legally allow a single investor inside tomorrow. Your grand premiere is over. Your funding is gone. Your empire is a crime scene." I ended the call, dropping the burner phone directly into a metal trash can. Despite my clear warning on the phone, arrogance is a terminal disease. Arthur and Julian Vance refused to cancel the grand premiere of the Valerius Tower in Manhattan. They firmly believed their own lie. They assumed they could outrun the federal asset freeze if they just secured enough foreign capital before the banks opened on Monday morning. The gala they hosted that night was a sickening exercise in desperate opulence. The grand ballroom on the ground floor of the newly constructed skyscraper was dripping in white orchids and gold leaf. A live string quartet played classical arrangements, while waitstaff circulated with silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. It was a beautiful masquerade inside a condemned tomb. Julian stood on the main stage, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost $15,000, but the collar was clearly too tight. A visible sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead under the bright stage lights. He was gripping a heavy crystal glass of bourbon like a lifeline, flashing his trademark charismatic smile at a group of heavy-hitting venture capitalists from Tokyo and London. Arthur was prowling the perimeter of the room, his eyes darting toward the main entrance every 5 seconds. The tension rolling off their bodies was palpable. They were trying to sell a 60-story masterpiece that was legally barred from occupancy. At exactly 8:45 in the evening, the massive brass and glass doors of the grand entrance did not simply swing open. They were pushed wide by the heavy, synchronized hands of federal agents. The string quartet missed a note. Then they stopped playing entirely. The sudden silence that swept over the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. I stepped over the threshold. I was no longer the invisible, shivering ghost forced to coordinate their parties in a clearance rack blazer. I wore a tailored, midnight blue evening gown that swept flawlessly across the polished marble floor. My posture was perfectly straight, engineered with the exact same unyielding tension as the steel suspension bridges I designed. I did not shrink from the staring eyes. I commanded the space. I owned the air they were breathing. To my right stood Marcus Thorne, his face carved from cold granite. Flanking us were 6 United States Marshals in dark tactical suits, their federal badges gleaming aggressively under the crystal chandeliers. The crowd of billionaires and elite socialites parted instantly, creating a wide, terrified aisle leading directly to the center stage. I walked down the middle, the sharp clicking of my heels echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Julian stopped mid-sentence. His jaw went entirely slack. His bourbon glass slipped from his numb fingers, shattering loudly on the stage floor. Arthur turned a pale, sickly shade of gray, instantly recognizing the federal windbreakers. Julian frantically grabbed the golden microphone from the podium, trying desperately to salvage the illusion. He opened his mouth, perhaps to call for private security, perhaps to spin a frantic, last-minute lie, but he never got the chance. Savannah was standing right beside him. She wore a stunning silver dress, playing the role of the picture-perfect corporate wife, but her eyes were completely devoid of warmth or affection. Marcus had met with his daughter at 3 o'clock that afternoon in a secure federal prosecutor's office. He had shown her the entire dossier. Savannah reached out and firmly took the microphone from Julian's trembling hand. She turned her back on her husband and faced the room of wealthy investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," Savannah said, her voice ringing with the razor-sharp clarity of a seasoned litigator, "I apologize for the sudden disruption to your evening, but I must urge all of you, in the strongest possible legal terms, to freeze any and all capital commitments to Valerius Holdings immediately." Julian gasped, reaching out to grab her arm, but she slapped his hand away with absolute disgust. "The man standing next to me is not an architectural genius," Savannah continued, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "He is a pathetic fraud. His family's entire empire is built on stolen inheritance, forged legal documents, and dangerous structural lies. As of 1 hour ago, I have officially filed for an expedited annulment. Julian Vance is a thief, and this building is fundamentally unsafe." She set the microphone down onto the podium with a sharp, echoing thud. She did not look at Julian again. She walked gracefully down the stage steps, passing me with a subtle, respectful nod, and joined her father. Julian was completely exposed, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. I stepped up to the front edge of the room. The elite crowd was completely paralyzed, watching a real-time corporate execution. I pulled my smartphone from my small clutch purse, because I had designed the entire audiovisual network for this flagship building. I knew the master bypass codes. I tapped the screen exactly once, behind Julian. The massive 3-story high presentation screens that had been displaying glowing, 3-dimensional renders of his fake real estate conquests suddenly glitched. The screens went entirely black for 1 agonizing second. Then, they exploded with piercing light, projecting stark, high-resolution images of federal financial documents. The digital guillotine dropped. The first image was the original, unredacted blind trust left by my parents, clearly showing a valuation of $2.4 billion legally belonging to me. The second image was the forged guardianship mandate, with Arthur's fraudulent signature highlighted in a glowing, angry red circle. The third image was the live structural condemnation order from the Department of Building Safety, proving the tower we were standing in had fatal flaws in its concrete load distribution. I picked up the microphone Savannah had left behind. "My name is Vanessa Cross," I announced. My voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly clear. "I am the sole legal heir to the Cross architectural empire. Every single building Valerius Holdings has claimed for the last 10 years was drafted by me. While I was held under financial hostage by Arthur and Eleanor Vance, the documents you see behind me are currently being live-streamed directly to the Enforcement Division of the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal." The reaction was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The absolute panic in the room was palpable. The venture capitalists began shouting frantically into their phones, screaming at their brokers to pull their term sheets and cancel their wire transfers. The grand illusion shattered into a million irreversible pieces. The room descended into pure, uncontrollable chaos. Billionaires scrambled toward the coat checks and exits, desperate to distance themselves from a radioactive, international fraud scandal before the press arrived. I looked up toward the VIP balcony. Arthur Vance was gone. He had correctly calculated that the ship was entirely underwater. He was attempting to flee. He sprinted down the plushly carpeted VIP corridor, heading for the private freight elevator that led to the underground parking garage. He slammed his body against the heavy fire door, pushing it open into the dimly lit concrete stairwell, hoping to reach his private town car and vanish into the city. He never made it to the next step. Marcus Thorne was waiting in the shadows of the concrete landing, accompanied by two massive federal marshals. Arthur froze, his chest heaving aggressively, his custom tuxedo completely soaked in terrified sweat. "Arthur Vance," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of pity or hesitation. "You have absolutely nowhere left to run. You are under arrest for grand larceny, federal wire fraud, and the wrongful death conspiracy of the Cross family." The marshals stepped forward with terrifying speed. Grabbing Arthur by the shoulders, they slammed him roughly against the cold concrete wall. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed loudly in the dark stairwell. The titan of industry, the man who had stolen my life and forced me to serve him for a decade, was finally chained in the dark. The mass exodus of the venture capitalists left the grand ballroom looking like a deserted battlefield. Only the flashing lights of the arriving financial press remained, capturing the absolute ruin of the Vance legacy. Julian stood alone in the center of the wreckage. The arrogant facade had completely evaporated. As the federal marshals escorted his father out of the building in handcuffs, Julian finally collapsed. He fell to his knees on the polished marble floor directly in front of me. The cameras captured every second of his humiliation. "Vanessa, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob. "We grew up under the same roof. We are family. You have everything now. Just give me 5% of the company. Just give me a fraction of a percent to keep me out of bankruptcy court. I have nothing." I looked down at the golden boy of Aspen. I felt absolutely zero empathy. My mind was completely clear, wiped clean of the 10 years of psychological abuse they had inflicted upon me. "We were never family, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the camera shutters like a diamond blade. "You were just a parasite feeding on my intellect. You thought architecture was about taking the credit for a pretty facade. But a true architect does not just know how to build a masterpiece. We know exactly where to place the pressure to completely demolish a rotten foundation." I turned my back on him. I walked out of the condemned building, leaving him kneeling in the ashes of his own hubris. The legal aftermath was swift and merciless. Federal prosecutors unsealed the full extent of the crimes. Arthur and Eleanor were immediately denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks. 6 months later, they were convicted of grand larceny, massive corporate fraud, and the wrongful death conspiracy of my parents. They were both sentenced to 40 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. They will never breathe free air again. Julian was left entirely destitute, stripped of his stolen wealth and facing millions of dollars in Securities and Exchange Commission fines. The former real estate prince now works a minimum wage labor job, pouring concrete for a municipal road crew just to survive. I officially dissolved their fraudulent firm and reclaimed my legacy. I launched Cross Vanguard, stepping rightfully into the position of Chief Executive Officer. Today, I stand on the 80th floor of a genuine, structurally flawless high-rise in the center of Manhattan. It is a masterpiece I designed with my own hands, built on a foundation of absolute truth. I look out over the sprawling city skyline through the reinforced glass. Savannah and Marcus stand beside me, sharing a quiet, victorious smile. They are my chosen family. The cold mountain air of the past is gone forever. I am finally free from the shadows, commanding the empire that was always mine. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? If you found this story compelling and enjoyed seeing justice served, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the donation link in the description or the pinned comment below. Your generosity provides the crucial budget we need to pay our hardworking team, helping them support their families and allowing us to keep creating more amazing stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and stay strong.